Hey everyone, what's going on? I thought I would make a really short video about what fascism really is, how we can define it, how we can identify it, that kind of thing. Just because it's usually our experience with the word fascism is as a political pejorative, as a way of insulting a politician or a social movement or something like that. But when we really want to know what fascism is, that kind of discourse can really muddy the waters, I think. Um, on top of the fact that fascism is not really, it's like it's hard to define because fascism materializes in a lot of different ways. For example, the fascism that originated in Italy is different than what manifested in Nazi Germany, which is different than what manifested in Argentina, and so on and so forth. So every kind of fascist regime is unique in its own ways. And so what instead we have to look for are overarching characteristics that can help us understand if this is really fascism or not. So what I did was I read Umberto Eco's essay called Or Fascism. And he has like 14, it's an essay of 14 different points that are facets of fascism that I think is really well, it's a nice roadmap to what fascism really is. There's also a book called by Jason Stanley, who's a professor of propaganda, but obviously as such, he's pretty familiar with fascism. So he has a book called How Fascism Works. It's really easy to read. Each chapter is devoted to a different facet of fascism. Easy to digest. I highly recommend it. It was also just very interesting. There's also if you can, it's a lot, but if you can manage it, the Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt is also really good. It's broken up into three different essays, basically. It focuses on anti-Semitism, imperialism, and then totalitarianism, and she kind of goes into an analysis about those. And then if you're also curious about how democracies can kind of backslide into fascism, The Death of Democracy is also a really good book to read. It's about how the Weimar Republic became Nazi Germany. And so I recommend those resources if you're interested in trying to understand what fascism is, or totalitarianism, or just authoritarian regimes in general, because I think it's really important that we understand and are able to identify when authoritarianism and fascist rhetoric and that kind of thing is seeping into a democracy, because democracies are fragile. They fall apart pretty easily. Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, lived through the collapse of three different democracies, and she actually has a book called Fascism: A Warning. So it's another good resource. I haven't read it, so I can't really speak to it, but it's on my reading list. I imagine it's has a wealth of information, but yeah, democracy is something that we absolutely need to defend. So what I did was I compiled a kind of, I call it a fascism checklist. These are different themes that I saw across these multiple sources that I read. So it's not by any means a complete compilation of fascist ideas or themes, but I think it's one that can really help you identify if something is indeed fascist or not. So this is what I put together, and I'm going to kind of just like briefly go through this. I'll try to be brief in the interest of time, but this is what I've compiled so far. So first off, there's always a myth of like a mythic past. There's like a calling back to a previously glorious state. It's built around like we need to rebuild and restore our glory. So Italy, for example, the ones that where fascism really started was with Mussolini. He invented it. Um, their whole motto was, we're going to rebuild our society, because everybody after World War I came back feeling pretty battered. Even though Italy was on the winning side, it didn't feel much like a victory. There was a lot of loss and unemployment, and there was still crisis after the fact. So that's where you saw the beginning of this rebuild and restore narrative. And then the same thing, Nazi Germany picked it up as well, saying that we need to restore our honor, because they suffered a very heavy loss with the Treaty of Versailles and everything. They had to pay reparations to the rest of the world, basically, and Germany was really struggling, and you had to, it would cost like a wheelbarrow of money to get a loaf of bread. I mean, there was mass collapse all over the country, and so that's where we need to bring back former glory. But that in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but again, it's something alongside of all of these other things that's when it becomes a red flag. And then the cult of tradition. There's always a cult of trying to bring back a mytholized, a revisionist and kind of eulogized, almost romanticized history of the country that wasn't really what it was. It's kind of an imagined history, and so that is something that is unique to fascism. So wanting to build a country and restore it is of course not a bad thing, but when it's trying to convey that in a way that that is not accurate with the history of that country, that's when it should raise a red flag. Of course, propaganda is a huge part of any fascist regime. Hatred for independent media, and then something called newspeak. So it's kind of this. This is from 1984, but the idea is that there's, don't believe your eyes and ears, for they lie to you. That kind of thing. That anything that doesn't support the regime is so they will call whatever doesn't support the regime propaganda. And so there's this mass confusion that happens in this society where where truth is kind of hard to navigate through all of the media and everything. And so it's very much an attack on truth and journalism, and this slides right into the anti-intellectual sentiment that you get. There's a great disdain for public intellectuals, or universities are often demonized, and then instead there's a glorification of like a rural life, and that sort of thing. Any kind of education is written off, or education institution is written off as a brainwashing institution and that sort of thing, where you go and they internalize Marxism into you and that kind of thing, and you're not really getting an education, you're just getting brainwashed. That kind of rhetoric is a facet of fascism. And then with the erosion of intellectual discourse and intellectual sources and academia and all of this, instead what fills that void is unreality and conspiracy and gaslighting. So conspiracies are a huge facet of any fascist regime. Usually conspiracy is used to explain all of the woes of a society. So in Nazi Germany, it was the Jews. There was a massive Jewish conspiracy that all Jewish people are part of the secret network to try and keep the rest of the world under their boot or whatever. There's always a conspiracy that is part of the fascist narrative, and that it really does sit at the core of a fascist regime. Hierarchy, obviously, every fascist regime has a leader that is at the very top. He sits above the law. He's kind of like a god king sort of figure. and I say he because it's always a man. Patriarchy is inherent to fascism. There's a great disdain for feminism and that sort of thing. So it's always a man. And a so and there's a massive falling in line of people that will consolidate themselves underneath this kind of God King figure. Victimhood, a humongous victim complex. So the Nazis, for example, they were the victims of Jews and everything, and Jewish people were the reason why that the German society had collapsed. It wasn't because of World War One. No, it was because Jewish people were here, and they've brought their problems to our country, and they need to leave. And once they leave, then everything will be fine. But until then, we are victims to them. So there's this massive victim complex that's always inherent to fascist rhetoric. Law and order, because usually fascism only arises out of socioeconomic crisis. There is a huge romanticization of law and order, restoring order to a society, and it's a very strict and regimented society that is called for, and that's where you get secret police like the Gestapo and that sort of thing. Law and order is huge to fascism. There's something called sexual anxiety. Jason Stanley as a whole in his book, there is a section on this, and there's an anxiety about who's reproducing, and then it kind of becomes, it paves the way to eugenics. So people have an anxiety about who's reproducing with who, and perhaps you hear something of like the purity of the gene pool or something like that. So this is where you get anti-miscegenation laws. That is to say, who can reproduce with who, and who can't. And there is a strict regimentation of even the relationships of people within a fascist society. There's the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you're familiar with the Bible, these are cities in a book of the Bible that are described as havens of sin. These cities, and they're barbaric, and there was allusions to homosexuality and that kind of thing. Cities are described as these like havens of degeneracy, and it's where all of the worst of a society collect, and they're leeches on the rest of society, and then that's where you get the romanticization of rural folk and everything, and that rural folk are inherently in opposition to people that are in the city. So it's this very much urban versus rural mentality, and the people that are in the urban area are these kind of degenerates. So and again, this, what I'm talking about is mostly applies to a Western mode of fascism. For example, in Bolivia, it's the opposite. The cities are where you hear a lot of this like very far right rhetoric coming out of, and all of the progressives live in the rural areas. It's the exact opposite of like America, for example, or a lot of the West. But in the Western mode of fascism, yes, there's this. It's the demonization of cities. Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. There's massive glorification of work. There's a lot of honor in work, and if you don't work for the country, if you don't contribute to the country, you're not part of it. You're in fact an enemy of it. You're a drag to the rest of us. So if you're going to be part of this country, then you are going to work, and there will be honor in that. And those that can't work are just a drag to the rest of us. They get in the way. And obviously, this isn't true. Very isolationist. They keep to themselves. They're very bad at forming allies. It's a kind of... because it's so roped up in this kind of ultra-nationalism, we are the best in the world, our country's the greatest, everybody else takes a back seat to us, it naturally makes you an isolationist. It's hard to make friends when you have that kind of mentality. And inevitably, even allies, for for example, Italy and Nazi Germany. Eventually, one falls to the other. In this case, it would be Italy became a puppet state to Nazi Germany, and Mussolini was, incredibly emasculated and had all of his power stripped from him, and had lost quite a bit of influence after the Nazis freed him and installed him again. It was all pretty much for show. The real benefactor was Hitler. And so there's a very isolationist view of the world, and they mostly act in their own self-interest. And again, the ultranationalism, there's a very heavy rhetoric. It's the entire zeitgeist is built around our country is great. It is the best that it ever will be. We will bring order to ourselves, and then eventually to the world. It's eventually it branches into a very warlike mentality, and we will, but it's framed in this way of we will bring honor to the rest of the world. We will fix the rest of the world. We will spread our greatness, but we are the epicenter of that greatness. And so it's it's very nationalistic. Hatred of cultural Marxism or Bolshevism or cultural war. Anything that's that I guess we would consider woke or something. Academic discourse, feminism, intersectionality, critical race theory, all of these things that they're written off today as cultural Marxism. But this kind of tactic has existed since World War II, except in World War II they called it cultural Bolshevism. That anything that doesn't fit within the narrative of a fascist narrative is this kind of Marxist boogeyman, and there's a great disdain and hatred for it. The first people to die in Nazi Germany were the communists and the socialists. The Jews came much later, but that's because the real threat to fascists are socialists and communists, and anarchists, arguably. But so something to know. Xenophobia, obviously. Anybody who's not within, fascism is the politics of us versus them. So anybody who's not within the in-group is part of the out-group, and we are afraid of them, and they're a threat to us, and they constitute an amalgamation of degeneracy that we can't afford to have that in our country. And so we'll build walls, or we'll do whatever it takes to get the ones that are in our country out, and to keep any ones that are already out, to not let them in. So xenophobia is a huge part of fascism. Corruption, you have a leader that sits above the law. There's countless examples. I mean, Hitler benefited tremendously personally from his rule, obviously. Every sort of king or despot does in that way, and corruption is inherent to fascism. There's always a funneling of the resources from the bottom to the top. Openly anti-democratic or faux democracy, they'll talk using very democratic language, but they have very undemocratic intent. They will perhaps there will be a major shift in voter access, or basically segmenting, cutting and severing different aspects of a democracy, but they will say that this is to protect our democracy, or it's to bolster our democracy, or something like that. So they use very democratic language, but with very undemocratic intent, or perhaps they'll hide behind a freedom of speech kind of clause, and then say that we're just protecting free speech, when really what they're trying to defend is hate speech or something of that nature. So sometimes they'll be openly anti-democratic. Sometimes they won't even use this kind of faux democratic language. Sometimes they'll just say, no, we need a strict regimentation of society, and democracy has problems, which is true. Democracy does have issues. Democracy is not a perfect system. you can, if you don't have an informed electorate or an informed society, they will elect poor leaders, and then those people will lay ruin to the country through their policy making. Democracy is not perfect, but that doesn't mean it's an argument for autocracy or anything else. Democracy is by far the best system that we've had and developed so far. Anything previous to that is, any kind of bringing a strong man into the picture and hoping he fixes everything is just going back to monarchy. It's a rejection of democratic values, and obviously democracy is what's best for everybody. That's why we have it. And the countries that are openly democratic are the happiest countries. They enjoy access to many different resources that help them achieve self-actuality and this sort of thing. So we want democracy. Democracy is good for everybody involved. Glorification of war, violence, death, machismo, action for action's sake, a dog-eat-dog world mentality, contempt for the weak. These things are humongous to fascism. There's the massive glorification of the hero and the one who fights for the motherland and this sort of thing. I mean, the motto for Nazi Germany was blood and soil. There was much honor and a drumming up of, war and violence and this kind of like faux, this kind of like flimsy idea of what strength really is. There isn't any strength in like the heart or in the mind. The strength only comes from the muscle, and of course this isn't true. Strength manifests itself in a variety of different ways. This is a very narrow way of looking at strength, but it's central. We are a strong country. Again, it ties into this nationalist rhetoric. We are a strong country. We have to by force because nobody else will listen to us. When really they're the ones that aren't really listening and usually have a flawed idea of what reality really is. That's why they have all this room for conspiracy and all this anti-intellectual sentiment. It's not a healthy way of looking at the world. Also plays into the isolationism. You can see how many of these things kind of tie into each other. And that's where you get this saying from fascist Italy, "Viva la muerte," which is long live death. This idea that there is that death is like this great cleansing of a society, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's where honor that's where you can restore yourself, like is through death. It's a very like death cult kind of mentality. Again, I kind of talked a little bit about the charismatic strongman as a soul leader. Usually presents himself as an unprincipled opportunist. They're very showy. They're very charismatic. They have a very strong image. If you look at like old footage of Benito Mussolini, he had very strong facial features, very expressive, all centered around strength. He had this very machismo kind of body language, and this idea that someone that is so set in his values that he will be a rock to bring the nation back together, and he is certain, and so that certainty is attractive to people, and they will in this because again this is a country that's in a socioeconomic crisis, so this is what they're looking for. This is what they latch onto out of insecurity. They see somebody that is so set in their values, that is so clearly an image of strength, that they'll look at this and they'll be like, finally, an answer to our woes, and so usually though these leaders are inept. It's all for show. It's exactly that. It's nothing that has any substance to it. Usually, I look at any fascist regime. It always ends in ruin. It always ends up worse for the country. It's never really worked out, except for the people that are actually pulling the strings in the system, and even then, they usually come to a pretty grisly end. The idea, so I said fascism is the politics of us versus them. There's an in and an out group. In Nazi Germany, they had something called the Volksgemeinschaft, which was the people that were basically identified as they are the citizens. They are the glory of the nation. These are the people that are in the in group, and they represent purity, and they represent a future for the country and everything like that. And everybody else is an enemy to that. They soil the otherwise purity of this population. I talked about plenty about how it rises out of socioeconomic crisis. There's an appeal to a frustrated middle class, this sort of thing. Draconian punishments and reprisals. This is also a huge part of fascism. Political enemies are not just political enemies, they're treasonous, they are terrorists, and they will go to prison for decades if they're not killed outright. Very draconian and harsh reprisals. Again, this falls into the strict regimentation of society. There is zero tolerance for anything that does not fit within the narrative that is being sold to the population. Disdain for civil liberties, of course. Fascism is the symbol of the fasces. The bundle of sticks with the axe, sticking out of it. It's a metaphor. That is to say that together we are strong. One stick will break on its own, but if we're bundled together and we all work together through the glory of the fight together, then we are unbreakable. And it's a clever metaphor, I'll give them that. But inherently, if we're all going to work together and have one unified unit, any kind of individuality or individualism that applies to any of the people within that system, it runs against the grain of being one unit, acting as one person, one massive force. There's no room for individuality. There's any individualism is it gets in the way of that, and so civil liberties are exactly that. They get in the way, and so those are usually tossed to the wayside pretty early on. A misinformed and atomized society. This comes out of the unreality and conspiracy and the gaslighting. This kind of like shifting of the zeitgeist is what will fragment a society, and the propensity for civil war skyrockets. So this is where that formation of the in and the out group becomes reality, and the people that are in the in group are very misinformed. There's usually humongous departures from reality. And in order to fit this kind of narrative, the mythic past, the everything that the country stands for, but it's all, drummed up into this very like flimsy image that is not reflective of reality or the history of the country. Dissenters, I kind of touched on this. Dissenters are cast as terrorists. They're treasonous. Any amount of disagreement is treasonous. Fixation on the children. Now, this is an argument that you hear out of right-wing populism and fascism. So a lot of horrible policies and things are justified through because it's to protect the children. The children are the future of this country. We must do everything to bolster them for success, which is true of any society. We want to set our kids up for success because they are the future of the country. However, there's this it's kind of sinister with fascism. It's, we need to give them patriotic education or something like that. Their children are the first ones to be propagandized, because if they're taught early that the country is glorious and that their work for the country is what will make their country and then the world a better place. And so this is where the Hitler Youth Camp comes from. They had a whole program that was fixed on doing this, and basically it was a giant factory to turn children into, little Nazis so that they could become grown-up Nazis, and the system perpetuates. So there's a huge fixation on the children, protecting them through any costs, and then and then using that as a scapegoat for other very like unsavory behaviors that ultimately harm the children. Really, it's never in the best interest of the children. The children should be treated as this I could do a whole video on how to like raise children. There's a right and wrong way to do it, and inserting this kind of ultra-nationalist narrative and breaking their understanding of the world, and taking advantage of the fact that they don't have any prior experience or anything like that, prior knowledge. They're ripe for molding, and so fascists take advantage of this and make them into little fascists, and then the system can perpetuate itself. There's a massive focus on symbology, the use of identifying images or symbols. Fascists love symbols. They love having lots of branding, lots of making it known that their regime exists and that the symbols of their regime are symbols of glory and honor and a future worth getting invested in. And it's kind of like a way to very neatly bundle up the ideology and make it shippable to other cultures and to get other people on board. It's because naturally all fascist regimes rely on the capitulation of their subjects, and so they need more of those subjects, and so they'll do that through brainwashing their children, making it through symbols and narratives accessible to other cultures and people and everything, so that they get on board, and then they have sympathizers in other countries, which makes it easier for them to seep into those countries and purify those countries, and so on and so forth. Normalization, the shifting of the Overton window. So as the discourse shifts further and further and further and further to the right, there's this process of normalization, things that were once outside of. So the Overton window is the window of what is acceptable in political discourse. Things that are too far right are unacceptable to be part of the discourse. But over time, as something crazy happens at first, and then there's this kind of normalization process. Okay, maybe it wasn't that crazy because now this other crazy thing happened, and this is kind of how this is how prisons for political prisoners become labor camps, and then people would be like, oh, they're just it's just a prison. They'll be once they once they really get the idea of what our country's really about. Then they'll come around, but then it's like, oh, okay, well, actually maybe they need to work it out of them. Maybe they just need to be, because they're lazy and everything, they need to be introduced to labor. They need to be brought in. They need to, through the honor and restorative process of hard labor, then they will come to understand that only great things come through labor. And so then the prisons become labor camps. But then after that, people realize these sentiments still exist. They're just not learning, even through the hard labor. There's nothing left to do but exterminate them. And then the labor camps become death camps. And so that is that is an extreme example, but that is basically the shifting of the Overton window, what is acceptable and what is not. There's a progression of like things getting more and more and more extreme, but over time, if you're not perceptive to those increases over that timeline, and you're only focused on the present, it can be hard to remember how bad the situation really is on its own, in its own merit. Because relative to everything else, relative to the other discourse, it's really not that bad. That's the process of normalization. And then country before individual, I kind of touched on that about the individualism and civil liberties and how those fly in the face of bundling together and acting as one single unit of glory. So yeah, those are kind of the main facets of fascism. Hopefully this was insightful. I see that it's a half hour. They're really, as I said, you can access these resources to learn more about fascism. It does take some time to understand what fascism really is, because you kind of got to get in the head of a fascist to really understand what how they view the world, and then you can start to understand how they make sense of the world, and then that's when you can kind of come up with these kinds of checklists, and then once you know that, then it's easier to identify what fascism is, and then anywhere it crops up, you smash it, and you make sure that it doesn't take root anywhere, because it comes to the downfall of everybody. Fascism benefits absolutely nobody. It is a manifestation of fear and anxiety and all of the worst that humanity represents. So if we can identify it and kind of curb it before it really starts to take root and flower and propagate, then we'll do the world a lot of good. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was insightful. Feel free to comment if I left anything out, because I'm sure I did. Fascism is a very there's a whole branch of study on what fascism is and everything. But I hope this was helpful. And stay safe, take care of yourself, and best regards. All right, take care.